Welcome back to Pakistan.
It's delight to be back in Pakistan.
So a lot has happened at the USAID. Well, since you left.
I think that USAID accomplished a great deal over its 60-year history.
What went wrong in Afghanistan?
We were effectively trying to remake the country. In Afghanistan, that was probably, as I say, we were probably too ambitious.
The same opinion applies to Pakistan.
Pakistan is not a failing or failed state. We don't need to build a nation. The nation is already built here. To conflate Afghanistan and Pakistan is a fundamental misconception and a major error.
So why has the Western media done that?
So that's a question for the media.
$6.5 billion was made available to Pakistan.
7.5 was authorized. In 2019, USAID Pakistan had to return $600 million.
$600 million was returned?
Yes, because we couldn't spend it.
You should have given me a call. I'd help you spend. $2 billion is game-changing money. The government or the folks in the bureaucracy, they were not being sort of aggressive enough.
But that's a question for Pakistan to ask itself.
Was that level of slowness visible across all provinces?
It was across the whole portfolio.
There would have been a lot of corruption in an institution
because
like this,
USAID,
in a country like this.
USAID had multiple layers of approval and review and audit and checks and balances, all of which were designed to make sure that not a penny was misspent.
How much of that single dollar would actually reach the ground and touch the lives of the individual citizen?
For 60 years, the USAID was the world's largest development agency, a symbol of American influence worth over $50 billion. And then, earlier this year, Elon Musk called it beyond repair. But what really happened? Was it reform? Or was it a hostile takeover of America's soft power by a billionaire? Today for this conversation, we are sitting with the former Deputy Mission Director for the USAID, someone who spent 37 years with the organization, was also the Coordinator for Economic Assistance for the State Department, and someone who has spent time in the harshest countries, supporting those countries through development and economic assistance. Skip Waskin is here to help us decode the real story behind what happened to the USAID and what life in the future of development looks like.
Skip Waskin, how are you today?
I'm great, Faizan. Thank you very much.
Welcome back to Pakistan.
It's a delight to be back. It's a delight to be back in Pakistan and a delight to be back particularly in Karachi.
So I wanted to touch on a couple of things. A lot has happened at the USAID, well, since you left and then over this year since Elon Musk came and then left. But before I jump into that, the one thing I wanted to ask you, you've spent 37 years with the largest aid organization in the world, one of the largest, if not the largest. What is one of the truths about the USAID that people completely underestimated?
I think that USAID accomplished a great deal over its 60-year history. As you look at everything that we attempted to do, of course, we weren't always successful in every single endeavor, but there were enormous successes across the world. And I think just looking here in Pakistan, and I'll focus on Sindh since we're in the province of Sindh right now, and look at some of the things that we were able to do. We built or helped the government build a new maternity ward at the JPMC here in Karachi. We helped the government build a new first-class medical hospital in Jacobabad, the Jacobabad Institute of Medical Sciences. We worked with the Department of Education to build 106 new schools all across the province of Sindh, which are serving about 50,000 students a year. And we've provided water for the water system for the city of Jacobabad, which is bringing water to some 300,000 people. That's just this province, and that's just looking at the last 5 years. So what I view the USAID as, I'm very proud to have served in USAID, and I view its record as having been one of great ambition and considerable success across the board.
Was there any point when you realized that development and diplomacy were just another form of power?
Oh, always. I started with USAID in 1981. I worked in the country that was then known as Zaire. It's now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And I spent 6 years working there. And it was always made very clear to me and to all of us who worked there that USAID was not an NGO. We were part of the United States government. And as such, the work that we were doing further the agenda of the United States in that country. So it's what we called, or like to call, soft power. Now, many people have said to me they don't like the term soft power because it somehow conveys weakness. It's not as tough as military hard power. But it's very important. There's nothing I ever did in my long career with USAID that wasn't hard, but I understand the distinction we're trying to make between hard and soft power. So in a country like Zaire, or in a country like Pakistan, it was very much in the interest of the United States that these countries succeed economically, that they succeed politically, that they succeed socially. And so what we were trying to do, this was one aspect of the United States agenda for that country, and we were trying to undertake programs and projects that would lead to those objectives, that would help these countries succeed. It is, in the case of Pakistan, it is very much in the interest of the United States that Pakistan be a prosperous country, that Pakistan be a stable country, that Pakistan be a healthy country. And those are the things that we tried to accomplish. So yes, our goals as a development agency were entirely consistent with, and I think really part of, the United States diplomatic agenda in this country.
If you were to define hard versus soft power, what is the difference between the two?
I think the fundamental issue is when people talk about hard power, what they're really referring to is military power. And soft power is everything else. It's economics, it's cultural, it's medical. It's things that make people's lives better, that increase life expectancy, that increase prosperity, that increase well-being, that increase democratization, for example. All of those things would fall under the rubric, again, of soft power. And one of the things that was very important for us, again, throughout my career, was the fact that by using soft power, by working as I was for USAID in these countries, we were helping to minimize the chances that the United States would have to mobilize its hard power, which we don't want to do, or did not want to do. It's much better use of our resources, much more cost-effective use of our resources to help people grow and thrive in their own lives than it is to launch a military activity. That's much military power. Hard power is much more expensive. It's a much blunter instrument, and frankly, I think in the long term, it's a much less effective instrument.
So are you trying to say that soft power is like the carrot and the hard power is like the stick?
I'm not sure it's so much a carrot, so to speak, although it could be used as such to incentivize governments, for example, to invest more in their own people. So yeah, I don't think that's necessarily an unfair comparison.
And so why would the U.S., have you seen, in fact, have you ever come across a situation in your 37 years where you saw that the carrot didn't work and the stick had to come out?
Well, I was involved in a situation where it's not so much that the carrot didn't work per se, it's that both aspects of our power were being deployed simultaneously. So I was the USAID mission director in Afghanistan from 2006 to 2007. And as you will recall, at that moment, Afghanistan was it was an active, what we like to call a kinetic situation, which is a fancy term for saying they were at war. And there was a civil war going on in Afghanistan, and we were supporting one side of that. So what we were doing then, and what was I made very clear to my team in Afghanistan, and was made very clear to me by both the U.S. ambassador there and by the U.S. military commanders there, was that the work that the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, was doing was very much part of the, let me call it, the counterinsurgency effort. And everything we did, we made sure that the military, not just the U.S. military, but the NATO military, had absolutely full visibility on it. And our strategy was coordinated at both the embassy level and in Washington with that of the Department of Defense. So we were two sides of the same coin, so to speak.
What went wrong in Afghanistan, in your opinion?
There's a lot that could be said about that, and I don't pretend to portray myself as an expert on Afghanistan. My time there was brief, and it was a long time ago. But in my opinion, which is less than an expert opinion, I think we were in some sense victims of our own ambition. We tried to indulge in nation building in Afghanistan, and which was always odd for me, because I recall the then candidate George W. Bush saying in one of I think it was the first presidential debate in 2000 with Vice President Gore, that the United States was not going to indulge in nation building. And then September 11th, 2001 came along. We became involved in Afghanistan. Effectively, this was at the first opportunity, the Bush administration decided to indulge in nation building in the most inhospitable terrain possible. And so when I got to Afghanistan in 2006, I found we were doing everything. We were effectively trying to remake the country in the image of a Western state. Sometimes I like to say we're trying to make the whole place look like Connecticut. So we had every kind of project that you can have. We had some infrastructure projects, road building projects, and energy projects. We also had human rights projects, women projects, democratization projects, environmental projects, everything possible. All of which were valid things to do, all of which had a constituency that supports them, all of which we were proud of and that I'm proud of. But in Afghanistan, that was probably, as I say, we were probably too ambitious. And it's arguable in retrospect that perhaps we should have focused on a more limited set of objectives that would have involved stabilization of the country. But frankly, what happened in Afghanistan was highly predictable. I recall one of the first meetings, the very first time I ever met the then commanding general of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, Carl Eichenberry, who at the time was a lieutenant general, later retired and became ambassador to Afghanistan. So in 2006, he said, "People, we have to be aware that the clock is running. Our time here is limited. History shows that at some point the Afghans will no longer tolerate our presence, and effectively they'll throw us out. It may be in 5 years, it may be in 10 years, it may be in 20 years, it may be in 50 years, but we will not be here forever." And he was absolutely right. And about 20 years after, or 15 years after he spoke those words, that's effectively what happened. We were obliged to leave under difficult circumstances.
Do you think that the same opinion applies to Pakistan, where you're spread too thin? Because Pakistan's been through its sort of set of challenges, especially after 07, 08, the Marriott bombing, and then the subsequent issues in the country in terms of just instability, especially security-based instability.
Exactly, but there are some important differences. Pakistan is not a war zone. Pakistan is not a failing or failed state. Pakistan is a vibrant polity, a vibrant economy. Pakistan is a functioning democracy. It's not a perfect democracy, but then neither is the United States. So I think it's very different, and I think in Pakistan, we don't need to build a nation. The nation is already built here. We need to help Pakistan carry out certain things that it wants to do. So we had a very ambitious program in Pakistan. You and I have talked about the Kerry Lugar-Berman authorization. Perhaps we'll get a chance to discuss that later on in this podcast. But that was an ambitious program that the United States launched in 2009 when they authorized the provision of $7.5 billion of assistance to Pakistan over a 5-year period. It's not Afghanistan. It's a very, very different situation. And I think that the prospects for helping Pakistan achieve the kind of successes that we wanted to achieve were much greater. I refer to Afghanistan as inhospitable terrain. I would not use that same characterization of Pakistan.
But for some reason, there's a perception, and of course, it's a running country with a proper functioning economy, democratic setup that, fine, could obviously be tweaked for improvement. But there is a perception in the West, well, up until recently, that Pakistan and Afghanistan are almost interchangeable. You know, there's a lot of people who come and visit, and they're like, "Oh my God, I can't believe this is what it looks like here."
That actually was my first experience, and I'm sort of ashamed to say that when I got to Pakistan in 2012, I really was prepared to. I thought I was going back to Kabul.
Really?
Right. And I landed at the airport, and I wondered, where's my body armor? Where are the shooters to protect me on the way to the hotel, or the way to my guest house? And drove to the guest house, and it was the middle of the night, so I went to sleep. And then in the morning, a vehicle came to get me, to take me to the embassy from E7 to the diplomatic enclave. And so I drove by well, drove by the Supreme Court, drove by all these magnificent buildings, and I realized this place is very, very different than Kabul. It is quite different. To conflate Afghanistan and Pakistan is a fundamental misconception and a major error.
So why has the Western media done that? What benefit is there in doing that? If on the one hand, the U.S. is saying we're going to use, or till the USAID was around, we're going to use the USAID and soft power to help this country because we need this country to survive in its state.
Yeah, well,
and the media goes in.
Right. So you're asking me why the media does that, and really that's a question for the media, right? Not for me. But that's sort of lazy reporting. I mean, there's a relationship. For one thing, they're neighbors,
right.
And there are issues between Afghanistan and Pakistan that they share a long border. The border is porous, and during the conflict in Afghanistan, there was no question that the Taliban forces found refuge here in parts of Pakistan. That is simply a fact.
Mm-hmm.
So the two countries the situations were interrelated, and there was a Pakistan aspect to the struggle in Afghanistan. But that doesn't mean that Pakistan was Afghanistan. Mm. And one of the great characteristics, one of the things that's not well understood about Pakistan is how diverse it is. Mm-hmm. Sindh is not the same as Punjab. Punjab is not the same as Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is not the same as Balochistan. They're all different, very different situations, and that is. People that think of Pakistan as one entity are really oversimplifying things.
And are there a lot of people like that outside of Pakistan?
Well, I think Pakistan is just not well known or understood.
Should some of that 7.5 billion been used towards improving the marketing of this country? India did a great job with its marketing. Countries have often gone out and sort of put out a best foot forward and changed their image and the softer side of the way the world sees them. Why not use USAID funding at the time for doing that?
I think it would have been great if we and Pakistan had been able to actually spend all that money. As you know, and as we've discussed, only 4.5 billion of that was actually made available, which is still a considerable sum. But the best advertisement for Pakistan, and really for the work that USAID was doing in Pakistan, would have been to highlight all the successes that we had. For a lot of reasons, we were constrained from doing that. There was legislation in the United States that prohibited us being USAID, from ballyhooing our successes widely in the American media. I wish we'd been able to do that. I think things might have turned out differently for USAID had we been able to do that. And of course, that situation applies not just to Pakistan, but to USAID programs the world over. So I don't think it's a question so much of Pakistan using American resources or USAID resources to market itself. That probably would not have been allowed, by the terms of our own legislation, because the funds were earmarked for very specific purposes, and public relations would not have been one of them. But the best public relations is success. The best way to demonstrate the accomplishments of one's government or one's country is to point to all the successes that we had, and those were considerable.
You mentioned that $6.5 billion was made available to Pakistan?
7.5 was authorized, yes.
Of which 4.5 was spent?
4.5 was actually appropriated and then obligated for programs here. And of that 4.5, not all was spent. In 2019, Pakistan and USAID Pakistan had to return $600 million.
$600 million was returned?
Yes, because we couldn't spend it, and it was used for other priorities.
You should have given me a call. I'd help you spend it.
I volunteered at the time, and had I gotten the money, I would have called you. But that, unfortunately, it wasn't. They didn't make it available to me. But that's really tragic.
Why does that happen? And that's not just Pakistan; it happens in different countries as well. But why did it happen here?
I think there was, again, one could probably write a PhD thesis about that. But I think the fundamental issue was that when the money was authorized, there wasn't careful enough scrutiny given to Pakistan's absorptive capacity. That's one thing. But more seriously than that, I blame it, and when I say I blame it, I'm pointing the finger at myself, because after I left Karachi, I was the assistance coordinator at the U.S. Embassy, responsible for all civilian assistance, all economic and development assistance to Pakistan. In other words, I was responsible for finding ways to spend this money. And goodness knows I tried. But there was bureaucratic lethargy on both sides, and not just the government of Pakistan, but also the government of the United States. And I think a less than there was no sense of urgency that the money had to be spent. And this was a great frustration for me. I was always trying to get people move faster, move faster, move faster. And unfortunately, I think both governments treated time as a bit of a free good. They didn't realize that the clock was about to run out. And I think that's an important lesson. Right now, we're going through a period of warming relations between the United States and Pakistan. And as a friend of Pakistan, I welcome that and I'm delighted by it. But I think that it's very important for both countries to seize the moment, to take advantage of that. It isn't clear what the future shape of U.S. government engagement with Pakistan will be. It isn't clear whether there will continue to be a foreign aid program at Pakistan, but almost certainly there will be in some form, particularly in the health sector, where Pakistan has challenges, like it's one of the two countries in the world where wild polio is still endemic. Measles, as you know, is a problem. And I expect that the government of the United States, again, I'm not with the government now, so whatever I expect is just as a private citizen, but I would expect as a private citizen and an observer of the situation, I hope that the United States will sign a compact with Pakistan for continued work in the health sector. I hope that compact will make significant resources available to help Pakistan combat these diseases. And I hope that Pakistan and the United States will learn from our experience under Kerry Lugar-Berman and spend the money quickly.
You talked about bureaucratic lethargy, right?
Right. I think that's what I said.
That is a very astute sort of observation and description of the situation. Can you explain what that looks like on both ends?
So let me give you an example from my own experience. I actually had retired from USAID in 2010 and was brought back to come to Pakistan in 2012 because they had a problem. Already it was emerging that they had a pipeline of over close to $2.5 billion. When I mean a pipeline, I mean funds that had been appropriated and obligated, made available to USAID Pakistan, but that hadn't yet been spent. So I was brought out to look at why is this happening. I was told in Washington before I left, however, that they knew why it was happening. It was the fault of those Pakistanis. They weren't moving fast enough. So and my marching orders were to write a report that said that. I came out here and I began to ask questions, and I was sent to Karachi to look at some major projects that were not moving. We, for example, had authorized the Sindh Basic Education Program, which was to build these schools. Not a dime had been spent 2 years after authorizing. We were supposed to build a hospital in Jacobabad. Nothing had been done. It was bare field in Jacobabad. We were supposed to put a water system in Jacobabad. Not a nickel had been spent. And so I began to ask questions. And for example, in the case of the school project, I was told, well, it's the fault of the government of Sindh. They haven't signed the PC-1. It's taken them more than a year to develop it. Well, that's very interesting. Okay, that's not good. Well, what about our own basic document? Sorry, this is too much jargon, but in USAID, the basic document that authorizes one to start an activity is called a PIL, Project Implementation Letter Number 1. So I said, where's Project Implementation Letter Number 1? Well, we haven't done it yet. So the report I wrote said, effectively, this is a shared responsibility. It's not just Pakistan's fault. Yeah, you can point the finger at Pakistan and say they're taking too long. They are. But what about us? We're taking too long, too. And when I wrote that report, some people weren't happy with me because I refused to blame Pakistan. I said it was, as I said, it was a shared responsibility, and partly as a consequence of my having written that report, since I was such a wise guy, they said, why don't you go down to Karachi and head the office there and see if you can start moving these things along.
Right.
And that was the next 3 years of my life. So, yes.
But, I mean, if you look at it objectively, right? So when my kids want to order food, right, they'll hunt for my credit card. Or they'll hunt for cash, and then they'll place the order, and then they'll just get it done. Or they'll just hunt me down and find out where the money is so that they can place that order. Now, they want the food, right? Or they want to place the order for delivery. They will make sure it gets done on their terms because they're the ones who are receiving the benefit from it. Shouldn't you look at it the same way and say that, you know what, the ones receiving the funds should have been hunting us down and saying, hey, 2 billion is, I mean, even a million can change lives forever, right?
Look, I don't disagree with that. Yes, absolutely. I mean, were I a Pakistani citizen or a part of the Pakistani government, I would have been pounding on the door of USAID and saying, why aren't you spending the money more quickly?
Especially if I knew 2 billion was appropriated and made available. $2 billion is game-changing money, for anyone. And the fact that if the government or the folks in the bureaucracy, they were not being sort of aggressive enough about receiving it. I understand that there was bureaucracy on the US side of it as well. But someone standing outside your door just waiting for you every single day, you're going to fill out that Bill 1 or whatever that was called.
Yeah, well, that's a question for Pakistan to ask itself.
So was that level of slowness visible across all provinces? Was that a Sindh government problem?
No, it was not unique to Sindh. It was across the whole portfolio. Again, lots of reasons for it, and partly is, to be fair, the United States, USAID was very, very careful about how it spent its money, and the level of what's the word I want to use? Corruption was very, very small over the 60. It was very low over the 60-year history. You would have thought that
there would have been a lot of corruption in an institution like
because
this,
USAID,
in a country like this.
USAID had multiple layers of approval and review and audit and checks and balances, all of which were designed to make sure that not a penny was misspent or went to the wrong sources. And of course, the system wasn't perfect. But as you look across the whole history of USAID over 60 years, and indeed the history here in Pakistan, yeah, there were some abuses, but those abuses were caught, and they were very, very small as a proportion of the overall funding. There is a center called the Mercator Institute at George Mason University in Washington, actually in Fairfax, Virginia, that does a ranking of every year, or did a ranking, I'm not sure whether they're still doing it, of U.S. government agencies in terms of their efficiency and their effectiveness and their ability to account for resources. And so it ranked almost 30 U.S. government agencies every year. USAID consistently came out in the top 3. They were very, very careful about how the money was spent. But the flip side of that care, which is important because we were accountable to the American taxpayer for making sure the resources were used as intended. But the flip side of that was it took a long time to use those resources, and that's what we saw here.
The bureaucracy part.
The bureaucracy part, right.
And so of the dollars that were spent here, like if I looked at every dollar and I broke it down, how much of that single dollar would actually reach the ground and touch the lives of the individual citizen?
That is a really, really good question to which I don't have an answer, and that one would have to study very carefully. So I don't want to give you a number, because any number whatever I say is going to be wrong, and it's certainly not well informed. And again, it depends on what touches the individual. If you're running a reading program, for example, is the only thing that touches the individual, the student, the book that he or she reads? Well, one could make that case. But maybe it's also the time and effort that was spent training the teacher. Or maybe it's also the time and effort that was spent to bring somebody like Skip Waskin to Pakistan to oversee the program. So it's a very difficult, I would say almost impossible question to answer.
And so when you look at a lot of organizations, aid organizations, they have to break up what component of the dollar is spent in administration and what actually reaches the people. Is everyone calculating it in a different way?
Well, in the case of USAID, there was a different pot of money for administration, which was called operating expenses. And the money that's intended to, the other resources that are intended to benefit Pakistan are called program expenses.
So the 7.5 billion were not, operating expenses were not a part of that?
They were a part of it. So, again, I want to be, I'm not certain, and I want to preface my statement by saying that I'm not certain. But as I recall, there was a certain amount of that, a proportion, which was probably between 5 and 10% that was earmarked for operating expenses.
Okay. Is there a global standard across aid organizations of what should be spent on operating expenses versus program?
Yeah, it's about that. It's something, if you're spending more if you're spending more than 10% on operating expenses, you were going to get you could be scrutinized very carefully.
Okay, got it. So with that stringent a criteria, and with the USAID having been in the top 3 of the performing organizations in the US, the perception that the beneficiaries oftentimes are the contractors in between would not necessarily apply. Because there is a perception also out there that, you know what, if you're a contractor, the best thing to do is be a contractor for an aid organization. You know, you're just a pass-through, you're going to keep your cut, and no one's really looking because they need to push the money out because it doesn't get spent.
Yeah, I know there's that perception. There's the so-called beltway bandits, and that certainly is not consistent with my experience. Yes, a lot of the money was spent on U.S. contractors. A lot of the money was spent on U.S. technical expertise. By and large, in my experience, those were sincere, dedicated professionals who worked very hard at their job and tried to make sure that the programs they were supporting were successful. So I don't view money that was spent for U.S. or international companies as having been wasted or having somehow not reached Pakistan. Again, I think the results that we achieved here speak for themselves.
So if this is a country where you were able to get good results, and Jim's, the hospital in Jacobabad is up and running, the water project finally is working. I mean, it's got its challenges and stuff. The education, the schools, they're up and running.
They're up and running, and they not only are providing education to, as I said, about 50,000 children per year, which, by the way, is not the entire needs of Sindh, but it's significant, right? Those schools, in addition to providing that, also, we worked very carefully with the government of Sindh to place those schools in areas that were outside the floodplain. And we built very solid structures that would stand up to environmental damage and to catastrophic flooding. And that's exactly what happened in 2022. And I just learned today, as a matter of fact, I knew and wrote an article a couple years ago, for example, about climate change in Pakistan, where I cited the schools that were built under the Sindh Basic Education Program as having been a success, in part because they served as shelters for the community during the flooding. They served as places where life-saving equipment and supplies could be stored securely during the flooding. And I just learned today, as a matter of fact, that in the town of Hirepur, during the height of the flooding, when it was raining for 48 hours straight and people were literally at risk of drowning, where did they go to take shelter and save their life? They went to the school that we built. So I view that program as having been really a stellar success, and it achieved exactly what we hoped it would achieve.
So if we want more successes like this one, right, going forward and with the thawing of relations between the U.S. and Pakistan and sort of with the newer structure for aid provision going forward, what do you think Pakistan needs to do differently the way it handles investments or aid coming into the country?
I think it would be very serious about looking carefully at reaching, first of all, you need to reach an agreement, a mutual agreement between the donor country and the recipient as to what the priorities are. And in identifying those priorities, I think the recipient country needs to be very, very clear about what it's willing to support in the long term. If the case, for example, of the schools they're a success, the Jacobabad Institute of Medical Sciences is a success because the government of Sindh was committed to continuing to support and continuing to fund those institutions after the end of USAID assistance. And that's exactly what they've done, and that's why those schools are still operating today, and that's why the hospital is still operating today. There may be other projects, not just in Pakistan, but elsewhere in the world, where there wasn't that kind of structure in place. And those are the situations where, in those situations, the activities that USAID funded are at considerable risk of disappearing once USAID funding is completed.
Because it's not a priority for them.
It may not have been a priority for the host country, or they may simply have overestimated or not taken the trouble to estimate what they could afford to continue to pay for after the Americans left.
So the first thing is, if there's a donor country you're working with, identify shared priorities.
Absolutely.
And then figure out the budgeting for funding those priorities to figure out once the donors, let's say the donations have ended, can you fund your way through it in the future?
Exactly. What are the recurrent costs versus the capital costs? I always used to argue within USAID that we should be focusing on capital costs, on initial investment, on capacity building at the start, but then one has to examine what are the recurrent costs, and you have to ask yourself very carefully who's going to pay for those. If you don't have an answer to that question, you are creating a project that is at great risk of failing in the long term. Because at the end of the day, I always used to bristle, as it were, bridle, perhaps is the right term, when someone would say the USAID project, the USAID project for this or the USAID project for that. At the end of the day, these aren't USAID projects. Here, they had to be Pakistani projects that USAID was helping.
How did the USAID know, how do they get identified as projects? Is it Pakistan that's giving the list of projects that they need funding support on?
There is... Obviously, there was a process of collaboration where back in the day, again, all this, we're talking about the past now because USAID no longer exists. So I'm describing historical examples from which we can hopefully learn lessons for the future. But what would happen is that every year the United States and Pakistan would sign an agreement. The agreement went through various names over the years, but they were called at the end development objective agreements, where we'd agree on a set of objectives and a set of activities that would be financed to pursue those objectives. So everything that we did, everything that USAID funded in Pakistan had to be enumerated in one of those, they inelegantly called DOAGs. Now, USAID's ability to fund particular activities was very severely constrained by what's known as the earmarking process. In other words, the Congress, and they did this with Kerry Lugar Berman, they said, all right, we're earmarking a certain amount for health activities. We're earmarking a certain amount for basic education activities. We're earmarking a certain amount for environmental activities, or you name it. And in fact, the earmarks got to the point where they were actually greater than 100% of the budget. So we had to figure out ways to demonstrate that a particular activity we were funding or a particular project actually fulfilled both earmarks, which is oftentimes a challenge. Right. But so it really was a process of, you have to think of it as sort of overlap, like it's like a Venn diagram, overlapping circles. Here's what USAID is allowed to fund. Here's what the government of Pakistan wants and needs. And where those circles overlap, that's the program.
And that is exactly the way you're proposing it go forward with whatever the new system would be.
Right, but the difference being that I don't think we paid enough attention to absorptive capacity, or to be more specific, to the ability and willingness to fund recurrent costs. I don't think anybody, and I wasn't involved in the process then, I wasn't involved with Pakistan, but when the Kerry Lugar Berman legislation was enacted, I don't think anybody did a real careful survey and said, yeah, Pakistan needs $1.5 billion a year, and here's what it's going to do. We had an amount, and then we tried to create programs that added up to that amount without really considering whether that amount truly reflected Pakistan's needs and whether it truly reflected Pakistan's ability and willingness to carry out the program after the end of U.S. assistance. So there needs to be much more attention up front to those 2 points. What's required and what can be funded after we're done.
And I think you're also sort of, to add to that, I think you're looking at Pakistan from a very holistic perspective, because in your experience, you would have noticed that each province, which sort of adds into Pakistan, operates very differently, has different levels of efficiency, has different levels of infrastructure and even human capital to deploy those funds. So shouldn't it be down to a provincial level that those priorities really align and then feed to the federal?
I would think so. And, in fact, in the case of the education program, for example, USAID's agreement for that program was with the government of Sindh, because education is, as you know, pursuant to the 18th Amendment, it is a provincial rather than a federal responsibility. So yes, and I think part of the issue was that these agreements were negotiated at a very high level between the two federal governments, the federal government of Pakistan, the federal government of the United States. And again, I don't want to speak. I don't have any insights into how Pakistan developed its list of needs and requirements. But yes, for health programs, for agriculture programs, for education programs, those are provincial responsibilities. And I think as we go forward in the future, whatever we're funding, I hope that Pakistan will work closely with the provincial governments to develop its list of requirements.
Did you get a chance to work with all 4 provinces during your time here?
I did not. I worked obviously I was here in Sindh, and then I went to Islamabad for 3 years and worked there with the government of Punjab and the government of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. We had significant programming in what used to be the FATA. Now, of course, the FATA no longer exists as part of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. We had very limited programming in Baluchistan. But we had a few small things going on there. So I worked with those 4 provinces.
So why not Balochistan? Was it a function of the population or the situation?
I would say it was a security situation. I mean, the issue in Baluchistan was that one issue was that we were never allowed to go to Baluchistan. My title was provincial director for Sindh and Baluchistan. But again, I lived and worked here in Karachi for 3 years and never crossed the border. I tried, but I couldn't get a knock, So, absent that, I can't simply get in my car and drive to Baluchistan. That's not going to happen.
And in your experience at that time, what was the difference between each of the provinces you worked with? Which was the most professional that you found?
Well, it depends on how you define professional. I found that
not slow, because they were all
slow.
very
Right,
slow.
they're all right. Exactly. It all varied. I'd have to say the government of Sindh was probably the most accommodating, in the sense that they were very happy to what we wanted to do. They were very, very happy to, and not just permit, but enable us to do. And so, I know Sindh the best, but the other provinces were sometimes more challenging. Put it that way.
Define challenging.
Meaning it would take a long time to get things done, to get permission to do certain things,
to spend money in their province.
To spend money in their provinces.
They would have a problem with you spending money in their
Well,
province.
there was also, there were, look, again, I don't want to dredge up painful historical memories, but in the immediate aftermath of Abbottabad in 2011, the government of Punjab was very upset, and the government of Punjab invited USAID to leave and not to provide assistance in Punjab.
Okay.
So for several years, we weren't able to work in Punjab.
Because there was history there.
Because there was history, exactly.
And the same would apply to KPK because of FATA or Waziristan, or?
The issues in FATA were, we had a robust program in FATA, and we had good collaboration with the government of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. The issues there were, it's just a hard place to work. It was hard to get to. Our own security people would have been very concerned with us working in FATA. But I think, given the constraints, and we were actually quite successful there. We were able to work through the United Nations, for example, and agencies of the government of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa to accomplish things. So again, it just goes to your larger point. The situations are vastly different. The situation in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is entirely different than the situation in Punjab.
In your 37 years with the organization, when did you feel unsafe? And where?
A couple of times when a soldier was pointing a gun at my chest at the airport in Uganda, in Kampala, Uganda. I felt a little unsafe at that point. I also had soldiers several times. I had weapons pointed at me in Zaire, so that's a little dicey. But the only time I really felt unsafe was at a place called Kajaki in Afghanistan, where we were helping the government of Afghanistan rehabilitate a major dam there that the United States had built in the 1950s and that the Soviets had helped rehabilitate in the 1980s. The Kajaki Dam is the centerpiece of the southern electrical power grid in Afghanistan, and as such was central to our strategy for promoting economic growth in that part of the country. I flew to Kajaki to see the dam because I always like to go see the projects that we're working on. But unfortunately, the helicopter that I was on landed on the wrong side of the river. So the south side of the river was controlled by NATO troops, specifically British troops. The north side of the river was not, and we landed on the north side. Right, and so we got out of the helicopter took off, and immediately about, 12 guys maybe clad in black outfits and carrying automatic weapons and wearing turbans emerged from behind the rocks, and I thought this is
Wow.
probably not good, right? Probably I remember thinking at the time, this is going to be interesting. I'm not bragging. It's not like I'm not saying, oh, I was so brave. I wasn't scared at all. I didn't have time to be scared, right? Everything was happening too fast. Happily, this particular militia was aligned with us at that point. And they said, what are you doing here? It's not safe for you. Get out of here, right? So we happily obliged, but to get over to the other side of the river, we had to walk several hundred yards and then walk across the dam.
Oh, wow.
Right, and then wait for vehicles to come and rescue us. So I'm not quite sure why we were dropped off on that side of the river. But yeah, that was difficult. And then anybody that's worked in Afghanistan has come under fire. So there were a couple of times when I was in a situation where the location I was at was attacked by rockets. So that happened. But in Kajaki in particular, on that same trip, on the way out, a mortar shell exploded. I want to say it exploded close to us. It was probably 400 yards away, but that was close enough for me. And we all had to take cover in a ditch.
That is pretty
right.
close.
That was too close, right? It's probably too close, right? And I'm the curious sort, so I was taking cover in the ditch, but I decided maybe I really wanted to see what was going on. So I stuck my head above the parapet, so to speak, and looked around. And the U.S. ambassador, who was right next to me, was a Vietnam veteran, Ron Newman, who was an exceptionally incredible ambassador, a very, very courageous and wise man. He yelled at me, "Get your head down, you fool. You're going to get it blown off." And he was, Ambassador Newman was absolutely right. Yes.
So, I mean, you've had these experiences, and you've talked about how sort of well the U.S. aid was regarded in its ranking, how thorough it was in its process, how much impact it's had in countries like Pakistan, in Africa. And there was 10,000 other people who worked in the U.S. aid, right? So why would someone like Elon Musk come out and say it is beyond repair when $50 billion was being spent in ways that were changing lives around the world?
Well, you'd have to ask Mr. Musk that, really, and possibly ask President Trump. I have, my own political views on that. I think that, this gets into domestic U.S. politics, and I'll betray my own feelings. I don't have any insight into it, but my own individual view, and I can speak now because I'm not a government representative, I'm a private citizen. I think the Trump administration wanted to make a point, and I think they wanted to find a federal government agency that they could dismantle. And so they picked an agency that had a weak domestic constituency and basically, let me be blunt, told lies about it. And
they told actual lies.
Absolutely. They said, for example, I heard a congressman say that the Sindh basic education, but that the United States had built schools in the Sindh province of Pakistan for the Taliban, schools for terrorists.
Really?
Absolutely, which of course infuriated me to hear that. And in fact, a gentleman with whom I worked here in Pakistan, who was my deputy at the office, he heard that. He had been responsible. He was actually managing the program, the Sindh basic education program, and he wrote to that congressman. The congressman also said, and USAID doesn't even know where those schools are. So my former deputy, wrote to the congressman and sent him a list of the the GPS coordinates of each of the 106 schools, and a description of the work that was actually done, and an explanation of why those schools were built, which was not to educate terrorists, but rather to educate children, and really to keep them from becoming terrorists, right? Never got a response from the congressman. So, again, there are other cases. They said, I remember even I believe even President Trump said, we were providing condoms for Gaza.
Yeah, I heard about that.
Isn't that ridiculous? Right. Well, the actual fact of that was that there was a family planning program in the Gaza province of Mozambique. And some brave souls in USAID actually contacted the White House and said, you need to revise the president's talking points because he's saying things that simply aren't true. No, they didn't. They paid no attention. They simply continued. It's a good story.
Yeah.
It fits the story. So, yeah, I don't have, I don't have any insight into the president's thinking, obviously, or Mr. Musk's thinking, but that's the only hypothesis or explanation I can come up for it. I think they needed to make an example out of someone, and they chose USAID.
10 months later, do you think it made an example? And how are the other departments
Yeah, I think you're
Worried?
Yeah, I think you certainly see that. I mean, you see, first of all, a lot of there's been a massive exodus of senior level professionals out of the government, either voluntarily or involuntarily. If they're not fired, they retired because they don't want to work for that kind of administration. They've been replaced by people. Well, the government has been significantly downsized, but to the extent that people have been replaced, they've been replaced by true believers, so to speak, in the Republican Party's or the MAGA movement's agenda. So yes, in that sense, it has had that, and I think other agencies. I mean, basically, it was an effort to demonstrate you need to toe the line, or else this is what can happen.
And there was 10,000 people that lost their jobs.
10,000 people worldwide in USAID, approximately. Yes.
How many do you think have jobs today?
Only from reading social media with my friends, and looking at that, I would say maybe 1 out of 10.
90% is still jobless, ballpark.
Probably, maybe it's 1 out of 6 or something, but it's the vast majority is still jobless. Yeah.
And what about those who were nearing retirement with their pensions sort of converting to sort of into perpetuity, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I feel badly. The way the Foreign Service worked, I can't speak for the civil service because I wasn't a civil service employee. I was a Foreign Service employee, but you were eligible for a pension after 20 years of service, and you would reach the age of 50. Mm-hmm. So if you were 48? If you were 48, you're just out of luck, even if you'd already been in for 20 years. And there were a number of people, I mean, I'm older than that. I'd been retired. I was already drawing my pension. Thanks be to God. I was not in that position. I was more fortunate than most. But there were many friends of mine, people who were 15, 20 years younger than me, whom I had mentored, who were just approaching a really great part of their career. They were moving into senior level positions. A good friend of mine was about to become deputy mission director in Kenya. Another had just become mission director in Senegal. And they were 45, 46, 47 years old, and they're gone. And they don't have a pension. Apparently, once they turn 50, they'll be able to get some kind of limited pension, but it's been a tremendous hardship for them.
Do you think that, sort of the billionaires are having a moment in America, right? Sort of like the oligarchs did in Russia in the 90s. And it's almost like there was a recent dinner with Trump in which the big tech guys were making announcements of we'll invest $600 billion and we'll invest $800 billion. And it became sort of a competition of who'd invest how much in sort of what part of technology. Do you think that the soft power dynamic is being shifted to the billionaires and away from government agencies?
Well, I think what's happening is that we've realized that the public sector by itself cannot and will not continue to fund soft power, and that really the way forward in the future is what some people refer to as blended finance, by which I mean that we'll have programs in the future that not only rely on public sector resources but also mobilize private sector resources, including possibly the resources of some of those billionaires to which you're referring. Mm-hmm. And I think that's actually a very good thing.
What do the billionaires get out of it?
Well, they might get stable countries and viable markets and places where they can sell their products or where they can invest.
So the billionaires would have indirect control over certain countries through their soft power.
I'm not sure that they would actually control those countries, but yes, they might have some influence in them, yes.
So it's almost like the billionaires themselves are like countries because they can fund these soft power initiatives in partnership with the government. Because it's running through a private channel, the bureaucracy and the red tape is much more limited. It will reach the end person faster, but it also creates an environment where now you're giving influence over, let's say, a territory to an individual, in a sense.
To an individual or to a corporation.
Or to a corporation.
Right, exactly. Look, I think it's a bit, it's a bit extreme to say that they're functioning like countries, because countries are sovereign states that have certain, legal and political and military capabilities that private individuals will almost surely never have. But yes, there's no question that the influence of the private sector is growing and will continue to grow. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I don't think that the responsibility for international development, so to speak, should always rest on the taxpayer in the donor countries, whether it's the American taxpayer, the British taxpayer, or the French or German taxpayer. Let's let the private sector step up, because they will benefit from this. They'll benefit from development too. They'll benefit from stable societies, and given that, I think it's very much in their interest to play a role.
Though I do think that the impact could be pretty significant, because if you can imagine a country like Pakistan, 65% of the population is young. There's over 75 million TikTok, Insta accounts. One of the tech CEOs says, I decide to shut everyone's account down. Imagine those kids without TikTok out on the streets. Like, they'll go crazy. They'll drive their parents crazy. That's a different kind of warfare, you know? I think we would all say, please, reactivate the kids' YouTube and TikTok accounts.
I suppose so. I hadn't thought of that scenario, but I agree with you. That's alarming, yes.
But I mean, you know, jokes aside, I think there is a way that you can create a level of control because you have access in every individual's life as a tech company or a tech corporation, which even Big Oil did in a sense too, because they were controlling the source of oil, and every individual in the US needed oil to fuel their vehicles to get to and from work. This is the same way. The tech CEOs are basically funding or running the new oil company, because information is the new oil, as everyone has been saying.
Right, and critical minerals are the new oil.
And critical minerals are the new oil.
Companies that control that, or countries that control that, will have disproportionate influence. Look, there's no question the whole of human history that power and money go hand in hand. And if you have money, you have power. I don't think that dynamic is going to change.
Going to shift.
Right.
And this blended finance then is a way for big corporates and government to reach the source, the materials that you need to be able to captivate audiences globally. Because ultimately, if you can control the people and you can control the natural resources that the people need, you have full control in a sense.
Yeah, in a sense, but I don't look at, first of all, the advent of blended finance doesn't necessarily change anything in terms of the influence of those corporations or the influence of money. The dynamic you're describing already exists and is going to exist whether or not those corporations indulge in development finance or not. They're already vastly influential. To try to mobilize some of those resources and work in partnership with the public sector to mobilize those resources to promote public goods like health, like education, like environmental protection, I think that's only a good thing. Again, the resources are already there, the influence is already there. Blended finance will be a way of channeling those resources into, I think, very legitimate ends.
So, I mean, with 37 years under your belt, what would you say is the one truth you've learned about progress or human progress or humanity, because you've worked in some very, very difficult environments and countries? There must be some similarity amongst all of them.
I think so. I mean, it's a very broad question, so let me give you a very broad answer. Progress cannot be imposed from outside. I, as a development professional, could not really change anyone's life. I could help make resources available, but it's really up to the individuals involved. It's up to the individual governments involved. It's up to the individual countries involved to make those changes. We, as donors, could only try to point the way and possibly facilitate progress toward a given set of objectives. But if those objectives are not shared by the beneficiaries, by the host country, by the country with whom we're working, nothing's actually going to change then.
And in terms of the USAID, the change that's taken place, it's completely shut down. Do you see it folded back into the sort of Department of State in the US? Because you mentioned to me that it was once part of that, right? The State Department.
Yes. Again, I don't, I jokingly said I don't have a crystal ball, and it isn't clear to me exactly what the Trump administration plans. I think they haven't figured that out yet. It's very clear right now the remaining resources of USAID are held by the State Department. But there are other parts of the United States government that provided foreign assistance and that continue to provide it. The Department of Agriculture, for example, they have a foreign assistance program. The Development Finance Corporation has a foreign assistance program and might be a very viable vehicle for mobilizing the kind of the blended financing to which I've been referring. So what's, I think, all but certain is that there won't be an independent foreign assistance agency like USAID again, probably not in my lifetime. USAID was created in a very unique circumstance back in 1961 when John F. Kennedy was the president and was supported by influential legislators like then Senator Hubert Humphrey. They worked together to create USAID because they wanted an independent foreign assistance agency to pursue, as part of the Cold War, again, we're talking about the link between development and diplomacy, as part of the Cold War to pursue long-term development objectives independent from the State Department's diplomatic objectives, supportive of those objectives, but independent of them. That was a historical moment that will likely not recur. So I don't expect an independent agency to reemerge, but I think there are several parts of the U.S. government that will administer foreign assistance, and the State Department is certainly one of them.
And so if you were to give a message to future diplomats or write them a letter, what would its contents be? What would you say to them?
I would try to summarize all the things that we've been discussing in this podcast. I would say move quickly, but be very careful what you invest in. Be very careful that the activities you're funding reflect the priorities of the people that you're trying to help. And be very careful that the people you are trying to help are serious about continuing to support those activities after you're gone. Because at the end of the day, as I said before, it's not your program, it's their program.
It's a great word, Skip. Really appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
It's a tremendous honor. Thank you for having me on.
We love having you back in Pakistan, and I hope that you can find a permanent home here and continue to do some of the great work that you had been doing during your last time that you were here.
You're very kind. I would love to. I love Pakistan, and I'm delighted to be back. Thank you.
Thank you.